Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Shots with Soldiers. Today, the General is unavailable for our presentation due to his work with the vaccination distributions in Ontario. But we have another presenter, a good friend of mine, Dr. Graham Broad. I'd like to welcome him and thank him for doing this on such short notice. And I'm going to hand over the room to him, and we will get on our way.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Thanks for having me, and delighted to do this. I'm filling some big shoes tonight. I actually wanted to talk about two people tonight. I want to talk about a guy from Western who was a fighter pilot in the First World War, who I wrote a book about, Eddie McKay. But I actually wanted to begin tonight, and maybe we could have a quick drink to the memory of a friend of many of us, Colonel Brock Millman, who I knew as Professor Millman was a professor of history at the University of Western Ontario, also the colonel of 4RCR, and then later was the commanding officer of the 31 Brigade Group deployed to Afghanistan in 2010. Brock was a very fine scholar who died 2 years ago at the age of 54. He would have just had his 56th birthday actually today. And very fine man, excellent scholar. When he returned from Afghanistan, he founded a group that worked to assist with the welfare of at-risk soldiers, providing mental health counseling, employment, housing, whatever it was for people in need. Brock was a really good guy, and all of us here at the University of Western Ontario, the departments of history, all four departments of history at the University of Western Ontario and its affiliate colleges, miss him dearly. And I'll just add on a personal note, I did my PhD at Western, and Brock was not just a professor, he was a friend and mentor and an ally. And so I'd like to just do a quick toast to Brock to start things off. So here's to Professor Colonel Millman. Thanks, everybody. Really quickly, I'm not going to turn, I'm a university professor. I'm not going to turn this into a lecture, I promise. I'm going to do this in about 12 minutes. But I do want to show you some pictures today, as I am a visual presenter. And I just want to confirm, you should be looking at the main slide. This is an image of Alfred Edwin, Eddie McKay. He was born in 1892 in Harrington, Ontario, which is very near Stratford, a very small farming community back then. It still is a very small farming community. His family still lives there. He died, as you see, in 1917. And he was a guy I was interested in for a number of years. He was a student at my alma mater, and where I now teach. And I wrote a book about him that was published at the University of Toronto Press 2 years ago. One of the things that interested me about Eddie was that he was a pilot at a time when aviation was still a new and experimental technology. In fact, the image that you see here, this is what was called a Longhorn. This was 1914 high tech. This is the type of airplane that the Royal Flying Corps would have gone to war with in August of 1914. Fighter pilots got all the glory, but the actual purpose of the Royal Flying Corps, in large measure, was to do photographic reconnaissance and to assist with artillery spotting. And they actually got very good at that. By the middle of 1916, they could turn around a photo in half an hour. From the time they took a picture in the air until the time it was developed and a print was in somebody's hands was half an hour. So that's not real time, but for 1916, that's pretty astonishing. And Eddie McKay went on to be a fighter pilot, but the fighter pilots, although they got all the glory and subsequently became famous, the fighter pilots were actually in a supporting role. Their job was to protect these observer planes that were doing their critical work. And McKay became a pilot at a time, as I mentioned, when this was a new and experimental technology, only about 10 years old. Most Canadians at that time not only had never flown in a plane, most of them had never even seen a plane. As I mentioned, Eddie was born near Stratford, grew up in a farm community there, and then in around 1910 moved to London, Ontario, where he became a very prominent local athlete, hockey in particular, but also rugby. And then in the autumn of 1914, just as the war was erupting, went to the University of Western Ontario, where then called the Western University of London, Ontario, where he enrolled as a student in the Faculty of Arts, which was certainly unusual. He came from a family of 9. Nobody else went to university in his family, and it was unusual for people to go to university at the time. Family lore has it that he wanted to be a dentist. But I think he actually wanted to be a pilot. And in order to be a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, Canada did not yet have an Air Force of its own. You had to join the British Royal Flying Corps. You had to be an officer. And the best way to be an officer at the time was to have some kind of university education. So he went to Western just as the war was erupting, and there he excelled in sports. This is him in the rugby team uniform circa 1914. They won the Dominion Championships that year, which is this grandiose title for a league that only had 6 teams, but that cup eventually evolved into the Grey Cup. At the end of his 1 year of university in May of 1914, he finished his exams, very respectable grades, 3 C's, a B, and an A, which was very respectable at the time. He decided to leave Western and join the British Royal Flying Corps. Right around the time, by the way, that the Second Battle of Ypres happened, the Canadian Army's first major engagement in the First World War, and also when the Lusitania was sunk. This propelled a lot of Canadians to sign up. As I mentioned, in order to be a pilot at the time, you had to be an officer first. He joined the Canadian militia. There's him in 33rd Huron Regiment uniform. Became a lieutenant in the Canadian militia. And the other thing you had to do was you had to get your civilian pilot's license first. This helped take the training burden off the overstressed British training system. The problem with getting flight training in Canada at the time was that there was only one flight school in the country, that was in Toronto, Long Branch in Mississauga. And the summer of 1915 was very wet, and they didn't get a lot of flying in, and not many pilots passed through that program. So Eddie went down to the Wright Brothers Flying School, actually, in Dayton, Ohio, and learned to fly from the source, learned to fly from Orville Wright, the surviving Wright brothers. And there's a group, these are all Canadians who went down there that summer to learn to fly, to get their flying credentials, to then go on to either the Royal Flying Corps or the Royal Naval Air Service, which was the Royal Navy's equivalent. Those two things were merged into the Royal Air Force in 1918. McKay's in the back row there, very coincidentally, by the way. So that's McKay on the right. On his left is Roy Brown. Roy Brown from Carleton Place. Roy Brown went on to gain fame for being the man who shot down the Red Baron. And Eddie McKay gained fame, erroneously actually, for being the man to shoot down the Red Baron's teacher, Oswald Bolke. I'll talk about that in a second. It was supposed to be an 8-day course. It actually took about 8 weeks. The weather was so bad they had to go down to Georgia to finish their flying there. But after about 5 hours of flying time in the air, he got this. This is the Aero Club of America certificate number 401. So he was the 401st person to be certified by the Aero Club of America as a pilot. That's his original pilot's license from 1916, February 1916. He was probably one of the first 50 or so Canadians to become a licensed pilot. Then went overseas for advanced training with the Royal Flying Corps. And here he is in the Royal Flying Corps uniform. They dressed like cavalry officers, right? With the swagger stick and the Sam Brown belt and the cavalry breeches. They styled themselves like cavalrymen. He was very fortunate to arrive at a time when the RFC took its experience from the first 2 years of the war, and the pilot training was beginning to evolve. When the war began, it wasn't uncommon for them to send a pilot to the front line of 12, 15 hours. By the time McKay arrived, pilots were getting about 40 or 50 hours of training, which still wasn't much by later standards, but by the standards of the time was pretty good. He received about 50 hours of flight training in England before heading overseas to France, just in time for the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916. And that's his logbook. I was able to locate it. His logbook was returned with his personal effects after his death, still in the hands of one of his family members, a second cousin. And it was indispensable for the writing of the book. McKay, when he was dispatched to France, would fly with 24 Squadron. 24 Squadron was the first British fighter squadron. In other words, the first squadron devoted solely to combat in the air. Other squadrons were mainly for reconnaissance, particularly photographic reconnaissance and the like. And this was 1916 high tech. This is a de Havilland II designed by Geoffrey de Havilland. And this plane's a pusher. You'll notice that that's the whole plane, by the way. Some people ask, where's the rest of it? That's the whole plane. You'll notice the engine is behind the pilot. The British had not yet worked out how to fire a forward machine gun through the arc of the propeller without shooting the propeller off. They hadn't worked that out yet. The Germans had. And so the propeller is behind the plane. The pilot sits in that forward nacelle without even a wing to protect him from the elements. This plane would fly at, say, 10 to 14,000 feet, extreme cold, very harsh conditions for flying with the machine gun directly in front of him. A top speed of around 85 miles per hour, but no oxygen equipment, by the way, and no parachutes either. So very perilous for pilots. 24 Squadron was stationed out of here. It's a town called Bertangles, which is north of Amiens, near the Somme River in France, where the Battle of the Somme was fought in the summer of 1916. That's the Chateau de Bertangles, where the squadron was quartered. Very, very nice quarters, and they had their way with the wine cellar. Apparently, it was just full of Veuve Clicquot, and there were local pheasants that they would hunt and eat. The aerodrome, which was just a grass strip, was just south of the mansion there. The commander of 24 Squadron was this guy, Leno Hawker. They called him the old man. He was 25 years old. McKay was 22, slightly older than the average pilot. Leno Hawker was the first person to earn the Victoria Cross for a combat in the air, and only the third pilot to earn a Victoria Cross. He was something of a legend in the fighter system, and he handpicked all those pilots. He apparently liked McKay, thought he was a very good pilot, and incorporated him into 24 Squadron, one of 18 pilots in that squadron. The squadrons were sorted into 3 flights of about 6 pilots each. And so what you're seeing here is B flight of 24 Squadron. That was McKay's flight. He's second from the right there. And I should note that those pilots in the front row, the people in the back are enlisted personnel who were mechanics and fitters and the like. But it's the pilots, all of them officers in the front row. All of those people became casualties, all of them. The man sitting at center is the flight leader. That is, oh boy, his name just escaped me. Hughes Chamberlain, Robin Hughes Chamberlain. He wasn't killed. He lost his foot actually in aerial combat. Somehow managed to make it back to the aerodrome before he bled out. But all the others became casualties of war. You know, the First World War was a very big war. It was a very anonymous war, millions of people in combat at any given time, but there were very few pilots. So for example, at this time, the British Expeditionary Force in France had about 1.5 million personnel. Out of those, about 500 were pilots. So pilots were very rare, and they really captured the imagination of people on the home front. Pilots seemed to hearken the future, but at once harken back to the past, to a kind of chivalric past of knights dueling in single combats. And hence they were styled the Knights of the Air. And they became local celebrities. This is a small assortment of news coverage of Eddie McKay that appeared in the London Free Press and the London Advertiser, which was another daily at the time, and other local papers. The papers were full of his exploits and very, very poor censorship and media control at the time. They published verbatim letters that he sent home and the like, telling his stories of his exploits overseas. Some of these stories were completely confected by the local press. Some of them greatly exaggerated, and some of them, pretty reliable accounts of what occurred overseas, often very graphic about how violent the war could be. In October of 1916, Eddie McKay briefly became the first Canadian aviator in the First World War to become nationally famous. Because of a combat he got into with this guy. Oswald Boelke was the father of the German fighter force and the mentor of Manfred von Richthofen, who went on to become the infamous Red Baron. Boelke really developed the German fighter force. There's still a Luftwaffe squadron named after him. In October of 1916, Boelke, von Richthofen, and the rest of his squadron fell upon Eddie McKay and another Canadian flying with the RSC named Arthur Knight, and they had a long combat. In the process of that combat, Boelke collided with his wingman and was killed. Somehow, the Canadian press twisted this story into the claim that Eddie McKay had actually shot Boelke down. In fact, this is not what happened. Boelke was killed in an accident, and McKay himself in a letter home clarified what had happened. But you can see here in the London Advertiser, London boy sends great German flyer to his death. Aviator Eddie McKay of this city was the heroic airman who caused the death of the king of German flyers, Captain Boelke. In fact, that's not what occurred. But nonetheless, he became nationally famous. And this story was actually picked up by the New York Times and widely propagated in the United States as well. So about a year before people like Billy Bishop became famous, Eddie McKay was well known to Canadians at the time. After serving about 10 months at the front with 24 Squadron, and this at a time when the life expectancy of pilots was about 16 weeks, McKay was transferred back to England, where he trained pilots for about 6 months at the Central Flying School in Uphaven near Stonehenge. And then he volunteered to go back to the front. I've often been puzzled about why he volunteered to go back to the front when he was safe at home. But I think if you read the sports reporting about Eddie McKay, you know that he hated losing. He hated being behind. He was a bit mean on the sports field. I think he wanted to go back to the front and get even for some lost friends. Returned to the front as a flight leader in 23 Squadron. This is not him. That's a famous American ace, also called Eddie. That's Eddie Rickenbacker. The reason I have this slide is because that's the plane that McKay was flying when he returned. It's a type of plane that's a SPAD, a much more advanced plane that he had been flying a year before. And flying these, he had a very successful 2 months at the front with 23 Squadron. But then on the 27th of December, 1917, the day this picture was taken, actually, by a French-Canadian pilot named Georges Trudeau, no relation that I know of. Eddie McKay went out on his last patrol and was shot down diving on a German two-seater. His plane spiraled out of control, crashing somewhere behind the lines on the Ypres salient near Passchendaele. And his body was recovered by the Germans, but subsequently lost. The book I wrote about him is called 1 in a Thousand, The Life and Death of Captain Eddie McKay, Royal Flying Corps. It's available with the University of Toronto Press. You can pick up the Kindle for about $15, I think. They priced the paperback to sell, which I liked. It was $25 for the paperback. And the book is not just about Eddie, it's also a discourse on historical method and the limits of writing biography. Captain McKay is buried here, he is commemorated here. This is the Arras Flying Services Memorial to the Missing, along with 1,000 other pilots, British and Commonwealth pilots of the First World War, who have no known grave. So, and I was there with Bruce Moncourt in 2013. And so if you don't mind, folks, I would like to raise a toast. I have some Calvados here to Captain Alfred Edwin Eddie McKay.
Captain McKay. Okay, that was amazing. So we're gonna.
That was a whirlwind. I've never done that fast. That's a 40-minute talk normally.
So we're going to open it up for a little bit of Q&A. Everybody's got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Grambrod what your question is.
Could you repeat the life expectancy of the, did you say 16?
Well, yeah, 16 weeks in his squadron. I looked at 72 pilots who passed through that squadron, and the life expectancy seemed to be about 16 weeks. It got worse later, actually. In March of 17, at one point, it was down to about that many days for a pilot at the front. And when you consider that they didn't fly every day, right? Because the planes were really subject to the vagaries of weather, for example, and ordinary duty rotation. The number of hours that a pilot would be in the air before being killed could be shockingly low at times. McKay ended up with about 500 hours total flying time by the time he was killed, and that would have been remarkably high for most First World War pilots, at least ones who served at his point in the war.
Graham, my wife's grandfather also flew as a fighter pilot early in that, and we have actually his personal diary in the cottage here. And one of the best parts of it is when he describes what it means to fly, to be like trying to find his bearings on the 401 as he's trying to take his training in the Long Branch. What did you have access to his personal diaries, and if so, what character traits struck you?
So one of the great challenges I had writing this was asking the question, could I write a biography of someone who wasn't famous and who didn't leave a lot of records behind? I mean, you just did not anticipate the needs of future historians at all, right? And so I had scraps of letters from him, and I had his personal logbook. And he was remarkably loquacious in his logbook. So I did manage to get a sense of him. The other way I got a sense of him was running down materials from his squadron mates who talked about him in various forms, including an interview that was recorded as late as 1970. He had a reputation for being very funny, a bit of a troublemaker. He got passed over for promotion a couple times. After the Bolke incident, they had a big party with all the local brass and McKay apparently did what was described as a highly irreverent impression of General Haig, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force. And I think this is the reason why he never got a medal. Other people got the Military Cross for doing less. One of his officers referred to him as too outspoken and reckless a colonial to be promoted, which I thought was a wonderful potential title for the book. We didn't go with it. He got very good at what he did. He brought down about 14 German planes. So he had a lethal skill. And people seem to like him. I mean, the other pilots seem to like him, not necessarily the more senior officers. The other pilots seem to like him. And I guess the final thing I'd say to you is that he was just like all such people, was astonishingly brave. I mean, you look at those planes, to even fly in one of those things. I mean, we all travel by air, and I get slightly nervous in a 757 on takeoff. I mean, to go up in a DH2 or something like that, to even fly, you had to be a remarkably brave individual, let alone to engage in combat.
Graham, we have a question from our Facebook Live.
Yeah.
What was the average speed that these planes went at?
So the DH2 would max out around 85 miles per hour. The SPAD maybe around 100, which doesn't sound very fast to us, but if they consider that at that time, that's about as fast as anybody had ever gone, right? And also consider the closing speed of two aircraft, say, approaching one another head on in combat. Now you're dealing with, say, 200 miles per hour, say 300 kilometers an hour. So aerial combat could be very fast at the time. But certainly compared to later planes, they seem to plod along compared to later planes. But we often forget that before the invention of the steam locomotive, the fastest anybody had ever gone was as fast as you could go on a horseback, right?
So, do you know where his Memorial Cross was awarded to, and where is it today?
Oh, sorry. He wasn't actually awarded the Military Cross. As I said, many other pilots who did less were. I think that maybe that impression he did of General Haig resulted in him not getting a medal. He was certainly in the pool for one after the Oswald Balke incident, where Balke went down in combat with him, but he never got one. He certainly would have. He certainly would have gotten the Military Cross or the Distinguished Flying Cross had he lived.
And then there's another question: is it true that pilots would shoot handheld guns at the enemy?
At the beginning of the war, certainly. Yeah, the beginning of the war, before the planes were properly armed, observer planes would take rifles up, pistols, and then gradually they'd sort of jury-rig machine guns and so forth. And that was the beginning of aerial combat. So the DH-2 that you saw there was really the first British purpose-built fighter plane. It had no other purpose other than to engage in aerial combat.
And so we got a question. He was never recovered.
Yeah. So I found out late in writing the book through records at the Swiss Red Cross, who liaised between the two sides about missing and prisoners of war, that his body was recovered by the Germans, but subsequently lost. Probably would have been buried in a temporary plot. And then when battle lines shifted late in the war, his remains were lost. And hence the reason he's commemorated on a memorial to the missing. I should note that about a third of all Canadians in the First World War who were killed in the First World War have no known grave. They're listed on names on memorials to the missing.
We have Joel, do you want to ask that question?
Sure. Graham, my question is, what prompted you to write a biography on McKay as opposed to others? And Tim Cook, in his recent book, Fight for History, has pointed out that Canadian military historians and or veterans themselves have been really poor in delivering biographies. We are very short of biographies.
Yeah.
And so it interests me that you would choose McKay, who did not show up well in the medal chart. Interesting from your talk, very good talk. As opposed to others. I have Basil Hobbs's files, and there's, he also went to train with Orville and Wilbur Wright, but he flew with the Royal Naval Flying Corps, Military Cross winner, so on. There are a lot of biographies that need to be written. Why did you choose this one?
Yeah, I think two things attracted me to McKay. One is that he'd been a student at my alma mater and at the institution where I teach. So there was that kind of immediate appeal that he was someone local. And I also had a unique access to certain records of his from the early part of his life before he became a pilot. And the second reason is that I sometimes worry that we get fixated on famous aces, the Billy Bishops and the Billy Barkers and so forth. And I'm not denigrating them at all. They're extraordinary flyers. But we forget that the average pilot wasn't like that. There were thousands and thousands of pilots who did extraordinary things who nobody's ever heard of. And so I felt that in some ways his experience was more representative of what we might say the average pilot or the average fighter pilot, if there was such a thing. And so those two things attracted me about him: the fact that he was local and the fact that he was kind of an ordinary pilot as they went at the time. But yeah, I'm all for teaching history through biography, and Tim's a friend of mine, and we've had that conversation many times. Yeah.
We have a question from Scott Maxwell. Scott, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Well, first off, it's my first session, so can you hear me? Okay. Hi. Salute.
Hi.
Friends of mine. Graham, nice to meet you. Kevin Newman, Gord, Joel, Carrie, Bruce. It's my first time on this wonderful session. So I had the pleasure of getting used to the military as a civilian through an extreme experience with a gentleman named Jan DeVries, who jumped out of an airplane onto Juneau, and I was working for a member of parliament at the time in Pickering, you can believe it, Scarborough East here in the Durham region, and started to go through, unbeknownst to me, on right before Remembrance Day ceremony about 10 years ago, what it was like to fly across the Atlantic and how he was going to jump out of a plane and the speed and the crest and the whole thing. And it was I got involved in this whole space because my high school best friend was killed in Afghanistan in 2007, Daryl Caswell. But I was really immersed in this through the air really with a guy named Jan DeVries, who he had no one else to talk to. He started saying things when he was getting older about what he was thinking when he was about to jump. and what that looked like. And the sounds on the one half of the flight was, mirror silence. And the other half of the flight was mirror chaos. And he finished reading his book, he closed it, and he jumped out of an airplane. And I don't know, I just wanted to offer that into the group because it's one of the most powerful experiences I ever had, because it happened in the middle of, it was completely unexpected. I didn't ask him the question. Obviously, you don't offer a guy like that a question of what did you feel like when you jumped out of the airplane onto D-Day. But wow, the experience for those guys halfway around the flying across with nothing, peace, silence. He said it didn't make any sense. And then all of a sudden, all you could hear was the noise. And they told us to jump out of an airplane. It was just the most incredible gravitas moment for me as a civilian to understand, or begin to understand, how anyone could even think about that, what that would look like. And the fact that he survived and went on and carried on and came back to tell those stories, it's beautiful. So to you and everybody on this group for doing this, I think it's wonderful. We need to do a lot more of this as a country. And I just offer that up as a thanks to everyone here for doing what you're doing, because it's wonderful. And there's not enough of this going on in Canada.
Thank you.
That is a perfect segue to the fact that we are growing and we need more support, and we need a lot more people to follow our page, like our stuff, share our stuff, and hopefully as we progress through the time that we will grow and we can start putting forward some of this stuff to all Canadians. Our ultimate goal here is to make Valor in the Presence of the Enemy, a 2-hour documentary about Afghanistan soldiers, the 10 soldiers that got the second highest medal. Well, we want to see one of them get the Victoria Cross, and we want to see them to be put in the same categories as the Eddie, as the others, to get the same commemorative respect and the honor that they deserve. So thank you for coming to this episode of Shots with Soldiers. Thank you to Dr. Graham Broad for filling in for
Thank you for having me.
The general. He regrets that he's not here, but he says a thank you as well. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our 5th episode. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bruce.
Cheers.